We have people going around, walking around to take your questions. And I think the first is here. It's Rose who wants to pose a question. And you have a microphone, so
I have
you don't
a microphone
need
if, it's turned on. Thank you for that fascinating introduction. I have to admit I haven't read your book, but now I'll go get it, so thanks for that. One question that has been dogging me, I've spent my whole career working on weapons of mass destruction issues, specifically a lot on nuclear arms control and disarmament. As normal, and I think as proper, there is a lot of attention to these issues now with the INF Treaty in crisis and so forth. But how do you see the interplay of these new technologies that are emerging with these older technologies that do pose existential threats to humanity and have gripped humanity now for the past, 70 plus years since the dawn of the nuclear age. And before that, with chemical weapons, we just, as Ina was mentioning, acknowledged the end of World War I, and I was just in Ypres recently to again contemplate the damage that chemical weapons caused during the First World War. So long story short, I have myself been grappling with the questions of, are these new technologies going to outrun our traditional weapons of mass destruction as existential threats? Is there a way there can be some beneficial links in terms of constraining weapons of mass destruction from the existence of ubiquitous sensing and so forth? I've been also very interested in that, trying to look at more of the opportunities as well as the challenges. But if you could say a bit about how you think about the interplay between those older existential challenges and what may be coming at us in future.
I mean, it's one of the ways this is maybe not the best metaphor, but you can still listen to FM radio, driving in a semi-autonomous car. That these technologies will exist and be relevant to us in a kind of holistic way. There are two kind of answers to, I think, to your question. The first is, in my optimistic self, I would hope that the legacy of arms control from the nuclear community allows us to consider frameworks that may be necessary for the kinds of machine learning and similar weaponized software capabilities that have the ability, that could scale in a destructive sense far faster than anything we've ever seen before. That we can create off-ramps in an escalatory sense, for example. I mentioned the data about automated and machine-driven trading because we have flash crashes regularly enough now, where you'll have 1,000-point swings in the Dow, for example. We may need trading curbs in algorithmic warfare, where there is that blending, again, of not just software, but software and machine. And that can only come from the sorts of nation-state and leader relationships where there can be a red phone or similar, or perhaps even algorithm-driven one, where one side, for example, notices that they're losing control of their integrated combat capability, which probably will be machine learning managed, even if there still is a human on the loop, and need to kind of create like micro armistices, if you will. The second is the integration of the nuclear enterprise with machine learning is a really interesting challenge because you have elements to that today in its management that are both high tech, but also whiteboards and grease pencils. And that kind of reflects the reality of technology too, that these things will be coexistent. When you look at Government Accountability Office reports on cybersecurity in our major US weapons capabilities, this is open source stuff, there's a lot of worrying trends that I see about mismanagement on basic technological security that worries me about too close a linkage between weapons of mass destruction and automated capabilities, whether it's weapons release or target recognition. So there's a lot of potential to consider the very important question of should versus could when it comes to new technologies. And the nations, I think, that are more prudent on that may court less risk longer term, even if they cede somewhat a strategic advantage near term. I think that's part of the duality there, again, that I'm obsessed with, that I think is important to consider. How you have that conversation and make those decisions is a really open question. We struggle with weapons acquisition today, and again, buying, I think, from a future context, relatively simple systems. They may be complex, but they're not yet quite thinking, and our artificial intelligence capabilities are still very narrow compared to where we will be going. And we don't, of course, know the speed with which we're going to see these capabilities change. The recent emergence of really, really interesting machine learning capabilities comes in part from hardware, right? NVIDIA chips and other capabilities like that. So we are going to let the technology hopefully not drive the policy, but to some extent, if we let the policy lag too far behind, we won't be able to answer those kinds of questions in time.
Thank you.
We have 5 more minutes to go here. Time is running fast, but if I have anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question, please just give me a sign. Otherwise, we have 2 SMS questions here. In your book, Ghost Fleet, our vulnerability with regard to technological dependence is evident. Without satellites and algorithms, the actors are blind and forced to use strategic old-fashioned tactics. How is strategic thinking and strategy changing as we develop new technologies and capabilities?
I think the value of resiliency, which in Ghost Fleet has one manifestation of using old systems that are modified in kind of a junkyard hot rod way, but the ability to still be effective militarily, strategically, politically as a nation, without the kind of connectivity that we are accustomed to today, I think is going to be incredibly important. And again, the resiliency conversation that happens, even outside the security world, I think is really important. Because many of the challenges that we face that are going to be politically meaningful, but also globally important, for example, are going to come from extreme weather response, the sorts of capabilities that have military dimension to them, but allow us to use technologies in a way that may not be how we intended to use them, which I think is a hallmark of a lot of innovation. So the nations, to wrap it back up to the origin of the question, the nations that can best handle being cut off or delinked for periods of time, and that's true military operationally, but again also politically and economically, will be more strategically successful. There's actually an element of deterrence in that, I think, so that if you know that you can weather the kinds of network disruption like that, then you may be able to deter an adversary from trying to exploit those very gaps in the first place.
I know that Rose Gottemüller took part in a debate on hybrid threats 1 year ago, exactly 1 year ago, organized by the German Marshall Fund, where you said, Rose, that we cannot fight the threats of today with the tools of the past. I would like to ask you, how far do you think NATO or individual member states has come with regard to developing new tools and countering hybrid threats? And interlinked with that, how much do they share? We know from before that NATO allies don't share all intelligence. How do they share this, knowledge on new technology? Would this make a and B team inside NATO in the future?
I mean, it risks creating 2-track or 3-track member states technologically, and the potential for affecting policy that remedies that, though, is the scalability of some of these software-driven systems, that you don't have to acquire 3 squadrons of a new jet to have an effect, especially in a non-kinetic context. You might be able to set up a server farm and have software capability pushed out, to the edge, as they say in tech, to your military and police units that are responding. The challenge, of course, in a lot of the hybrid context is that the answer isn't necessarily hitting everything with a hammer, and much of the resiliency that is important, again, economically, politically, I think is extremely relevant in the hybrid warfare context. That the nations that invest in media literacy, that invest in network connectivity, surety, are going to be more difficult to disrupt when the very, very effective and exploitative tactics of hybrid or of hybrid type operations, continue their historical course, which is an enduring one, as the foreign minister said. I do think it's important to know, as much as we can look to one example and think we see that other places, my sense is that if you think about hybrid warfare in the high north, it will look different than hybrid warfare in the Black Sea. That the tools that we will see a country like Russia use need not be the same little green men, but they may be more economic or more intelligence driven. And I think that is really important to recognize too, that there is not a template for a symmetry in military operations. In fact, that's antithetical to it. It's more like improv.
Thank you. We have one more, the last question. Espen Barth Eide here in the front. Could you raise? Please, you get a microphone, yeah. And then time is running fast.
Thank August for an excellent intervention, and I think there's a very important message here to us as a country and to NATO and the alliance, and I'd like to reflect on whether that is correctly understood, that we may actually, now that we agree to spend more money and invest, we may actually be investing in completely the wrong things, that we keep buying updates or the modern updates of old stuff from the kinetic world, basically still making things explode. Whereas actually the new war will not be fought primarily in that terrain at all. And in that sense, maybe before we start spending more money, we should rethink this whole message that you're sending us. Otherwise, we will just keep up repeating what we always did, and we will meet the new world with old stuff. Is that what you're telling us?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
short and simple.
Yeah, you got it. No, the idea that, the conventional definition of an arms race is acquiring, more of a certain class of missile that has a certain range or a strategic strike capability. That is not going to be what an arms race, I think, looks like in the 21st century. And in fact, what if arms racing is economically beneficial because the very technologies that are most strategically decisive are not coming from the defense industrial base, but coming from technology labs and they're software-driven? Commercial technology, sector algorithms that can be as impactful militarily and strategically, so that the way we want to define it goes back to platforms and capability and what we call in the U.S. ACAT-1 programs that are big and meaty and expensive and have congressional districts attached to them. But the arms race, 21st century, may be able to be, again, software-driven. It could be bio-related. And the nations that invest in that actually may be doing so in a commercial context, and that has also strategic advantage. So does that lead us actually to a state where we have a greater risk of conflict? Perhaps, as those capabilities rise. It's part of what we'll be discussing, of course, in the next few days.
Thank you, August. It's fascinating to listen to you. And I'm really looking forward to the next, to these afternoon sessions and tomorrow morning. And I know some of you will have the chance to follow us out to Leangkollen.